Both the European Union and the United States are talking sanctions as they deal with Russia's response to political changes in Ukraine. It's the latest in an issue that's put a serious strain on East-West relations. Professor of International Relations Robert Patman is here to give his thoughts on the ongoing issue. Good evening.
Good evening, Rebecca.
Tell us a little bit about Ukraine and its history in terms of its relationship with Russia.
Well, the Ukraine's only been an independent country since 1991 following the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And for much of its previous history, it's been linked to Russia one way or the other, whether it be the Soviet Union or Tsarist Russia. So there is a strong historical identification between these two entities. And indeed, something like 18 to 20% of the population of the Ukraine is Russian-speaking. But we shouldn't read too much into that. It's essentially a bilingual country. That is to say, two languages used quite comfortably and rapidly by the population.
What does Russia want in the region?
I think Russia wants to build, Mr. Putin, this is part and parcel, the showdown we've seen over the Ukraine. It's part and parcel of an attempt by Mr. Putin to reassert Russia's power after the end of the Cold War in the late 80s. Russia's been in decline since then, and Mr. Putin sees his task, I think, to reassert Russia's power. And part of the vehicle for reasserting Russia's power is what's called a Euro-Asian Customs Union, and the Ukraine is going to be the centrepiece of that union, and that is why Russia intervened behind the scenes diplomatically to scupper a trade agreement between the EU and the Ukraine in November of last year, and that started the current crisis, which culminated in the convulsions we've seen this year.
What has happened today?
Well, what's happened today is that we've had pro-Russia and anti-Russian demonstrations in Crimea, and we've also in other parts of the country, and we've also had some diplomacy going on between the British and German leaders on the one hand and Mr. Putin in the Kremlin in the other. There doesn't seem to be any substantive progress. The Russians have confirmed once again that on the 16th of March there will be a referendum to determine whether the Crimea becomes part of Russia. This is rejected as illegal by the British, Americans and the Germans, and of course the EU has threatened Russia with sanctions if they try to wrest the Crimea from the Ukraine.
What are the issues facing the US and the EU as they respond?
I think they're big issues. A lot of countries feel very uncomfortable about the way Mr. Putin's handled this, particularly the fact that he's basically put in troops into Crimea, and if you hold a referendum where there's something like 20,000 troops on the ground, that doesn't necessarily mean you've got a fair and free election. Also, every attempt by the international community to put in international monitors, those monitors have been given short shrift and even attacked by, what are certainly Russian soldiers on the ground.
What is the worst case scenario?
I think the worst case scenario is that conflict would actually break out between the Ukrainians and the Russians in the country, and that could lead to civil war, and that could bring in the neighbouring countries. Poland is watching this situation with great anxiety. Poland, of course, has painful memories of Russian domination from the past, and therefore wants to make sure the international community doesn't lose its nerve in upholding Ukrainian independence at this time.
Where do you see this crisis going?
Well, hopefully Mr. Putin, hopefully a diplomatic solution. But at the moment, I'm pessimistic about that. I think Mr. Putin is misreading the situation, and I think he's underestimating the damage he will do to his own country in trying to expand the boundaries of Russia to reduce Ukraine to a sort of satellite status. I think that will come at enormous cost. 50% of Russia's external trade goes to the EU, and if the EU impose sanctions, that will have an enormous impact on the Russian economy. The Russian economy is only growing about 1.3% a year at the moment. We're not talking about a sort of Chinese economy here. We're talking about an economy that's basically dependent on the export of oil and also dependent on the export of raw materials, and is critically dependent on the West.
Professor of International Relations Robert Patman, thanks very much for your time.